Our Life as a Teenager in Medieval Europe, and more. Hook. Forget what you think you know about the Dark Ages. Forget the sanitized, dull textbooks. Medieval Europe was not a long pause between the Romans and the Renaissance. It was a place of astonishing beauty, brutal survival, and secrets so deep they could get you burned alive. This is the story of a girl who, by her 15th year, knew more about the world than any king, and whose knowledge was her kingdom and her curse. Castle, Chapter 1. The Weight of an Oath. The smoke in the hall was thicker than any winter fog, a greasy, acrid cloud of pine resin and unwashed wool that clung to the rafters like a second, dark roof. Elara, 15 years old and barely taller than a well-fed sheep, pressed her back against the cool, rough-hewn stone of the keep wall, trying to disappear. It was the feast of St. Michael, Michaelmas, a time for the annual accounting of the harvest, for paying rents in sheaves of wheat and sides of cured pork, and, most importantly, for the formal declaration of fealty. Her father, Sir Allard, the Baron of Viridian, stood at the head table, a man built like a cask of wine, broad, solid, and capable of holding a staggering amount of local beer. Today he was tense. His face, usually ruddy with good humor, was pale beneath the flickering, smoky light of the few tallow candles. "Repeat your oath, boy," Sir Allard's voice boomed, cutting through the low roar of the peasants and the clatter of wooden trenchers. The boy in question was Thomas, the Baron's page, only a year older than Elara. He knelt on the floor, his eyes fixed on the Baron's face, not daring to look away. He was giving the formal oath to become a squire. This was the pinnacle of a noble teen ambition, the first true step toward knighthood. Elara knew the oath by heart. Every noble child did. "I swear by the blood of Christ and the bones of the holy saints, to God my Lord and the Holy Church, to never flee a righteous battle, to protect the weak, the widow, and the orphan, to uphold justice and mercy, to keep the holy faith, even unto death." Thomas recited it, his voice cracking on the final words. The Baron nodded, satisfied. The crowd cheered, the flagon of beer was passed, and the ceremony was complete. A new squire was made. Elara watched, a familiar hollow ache settle in her chest. She was a daughter of the nobility, perhaps the most educated girl in 100 leagues, fluent in Latin, passable in the court French of the royal house, and mathematically capable of calculating the yield of every plot of land her father held. But for her, there was no oath, no ceremony, no great step forward. Her path was simple, predetermined, and profoundly boring. A marriage contract to a neighboring lord, a life spent managing a household, bearing heirs, and embroidering until her eyes went out. And there was the other path, the secret path, the one that ran under the ground like a river only she could see. Dual Speech Scroll, the Secret Library. Elara's true life did not begin in the stone hall, but in the dusty, damp silence of the Tower. The Keep of Viridian was a typical 13th century Motte and Bailey design, though the wooden palisade had long been replaced by a strong curtain wall. The most defensible point, the central donjon, or Great Tower, housed the family's private quarters. Deep beneath the main pantry, a room smelling constantly of old cheese and stale bread, was a hidden stone spiral stair. Only 3 people in the world knew about it: Sir Allard, the keep's elderly chaplain, Father Eustace, and Elara. The stairwell led down, not to a dungeon, but to a small, dry, subterranean chamber carved out of the bedrock. This was the Baron's library. In an age where a single, hand-copied book could be worth a farm, and sometimes more than a man's life, Viridian's library was an anomaly, a tiny beacon of the old world in the savage new. It was a legacy left by her great-grandmother, a woman rumored to have been a scholar exiled from a university in Italy. The moment Elara pulled the thick padded wooden door shut behind her, the noise of the feast vanished, replaced by an intoxicating silence. The air here was cool and tasted of vellum, beeswax and dried herbs meant to ward off bookworms. She lit a small oil lamp, the flame immediately catching the gold leaf on the spines of the scrolls. This wasn't a library of boring devotional texts and books of hours, though it had a few for show. This was a collection of forbidden, or at least highly suspect, knowledge. A copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, which described the motions of the stars and planets using complex geometric models. The works of the Arab polymath Al-Khwarizmi, the one who gave the world algebra and the system of zero. Elara struggled with the numbers, but the logic was a kind of beautiful, unbreakable code. And most dangerous of all, a battered Latin translation of Aristotle's Metaphysics, a book so profound and challenging to church doctrine that it had been repeatedly banned by the University of Paris. Tonight, Elara didn't reach for the grand, forbidden texts. Instead, she knelt and pulled out a worn, leather-bound volume titled in tiny, elegant script, Herbology and Chirurgy, a book of medicine. It was not just a collection of recipes, drink this broth of boiled mallow for a cough, but a rigorous, shocking examination of the human body. As she slowly flipped to a page marked with a thin piece of linen, the central image, a stark, detailed drawing of the human skeleton, seemed to leap out at her. Historical note for the U.S. reader. At this time, formal dissection of human bodies was illegal and considered sacrilege by the Church. Medical knowledge in Europe was often limited to ancient texts like Galen and astrology. To possess a detailed, anatomically accurate drawing was incredibly rare, dangerous, and a sign of radical, fringe knowledge. This book was a priceless treasure, centuries ahead of its time. "It will be Lord Hrothgar who will need me," she whispered to the skeleton on the page, tracing the line of the femur, the thigh bone.
The price of healing. Lord Hrothgar was the Baron's neighbor and the key to the family's economic security. His manor had recently suffered a devastating fire, and his only surviving son, Hugo, had been badly burned. The local leech, a man whose primary medical tool was a knife to draw bad blood, had declared the boy lost. The common understanding was that the burning had introduced an imbalance of the humors, too much choler, yellow bile, perhaps, and the boy would inevitably pass into God's waiting arms. But Elara's father, Sir Allard, had made a secret promise to Lord Hrothgar, a deal. "If my daughter, the one who reads those strange books, can save your boy, the marriage contract between our houses will be sealed, and the generous dowry you offered, the 3 rich pastures by the river, will be ours." If she failed, the deal was off. Viridian was already land poor. Failure meant ruin. Elara opened the book to the section on burns. The 4 degrees of woe. First degree, redness and pain. Cure with cold water and ground willow bark. Second degree, blisters and wet weeping. Drain the blisters carefully, then apply a poultice of St. John's wort steeped in wine. Third degree, the skin is destroyed. The flesh is black or white. The wound has no feeling. This is a grave woe, requiring the careful removal of the dead flesh to allow the living flesh beneath to grow. Cleanse daily with a solution of boiling wine. Hugo's burns were a devastating mix of the second and third degrees across his back and arms. The leech had simply wrapped him in linen and prayed, allowing the wounds to fester and become a breeding ground for putrefaction, an ancient term for what Alara knew was the slow-motion, deadly advance of unseen animalcules, or tiny beasts that the book warned about. Alara knew the prevailing wisdom was wrong. She knew that the putrefaction came not from an imbalance of humors, but from the filth of the wound. She carefully transcribed the recipe for the poultice onto a piece of scraped clean parchment using a thin piece of charcoal. Ingredients for healing: a handful of fresh St. John's wort, easy to find in the late season, a flask of strong distilled wine. The book stressed the aqua vitae, which was actually an early form of alcohol and antiseptic. Honey, the most critical part. The book called it Deus's golden ointment because of its natural, thick, and protective properties. A generous amount of clean linen strips, sterilized by boiling. The most vital step was the one she could not write down for fear of discovery: debridement. She would have to cut away the dead, black flesh, an agonizing, terrible act of surgery performed without the benefit of any true anesthetic, only the numbing effect of wine and prayer. "I am a daughter of a baron, not a butcher," she thought, her stomach twisting. "But if I don't do this, Hugo will surely die, and my family will fall."
The night of the journey. The festivities ended close to midnight. The drunken revelers stumbled out. The men-at-arms slumped by the hearth, and silence, deep and cold, finally settled over Viridian Keep. Ilara waited until the watchman's slow, uneven footsteps had passed her door twice. Then she moved. She wore her oldest, darkest tunic and breeches, a scandalous choice for a noblewoman, but practical for a midnight ride. She slung a small leather satchel across her shoulder containing the key ingredients: the charcoal transcription, a jar of precious honey, and a small, razor-sharp hunting knife she had secretly sharpened on the keep's grindstone. The wine she had to acquire. She slipped into the pantry. The massive iron-banded casks of wine and beer were lined against the back wall. She carefully used a small brass siphon tube, a tool she had found in a box of old discarded implements, to draw off the strongest, clearest vintage into a flask. This firewater was the only thing that could clean the wound and perhaps dull Hugo's pain. The hardest part was leaving the keep unnoticed. She didn't dare go through the main gate. Instead, she headed for the laundry well. It was a frightening, slimy descent. She tied a thick, braided rope to the winch and began to lower herself, hand over hand, down the damp stone shaft, past the level where the water was drawn, and down into the dry-dug drain tunnel that led outside the bailey wall. The drain was meant for overflow and rainwater, and now her secret escape. It was narrow, smelling of wet earth and sewage, and the slick moss on the walls scraped against her shoulder. For 10 minutes she crawled, feeling the weight of the massive stone keep above her. Finally, she saw a pinprick of moonlight. She pushed a heavy, disguised stone aside, a secret known only to her and her father, and slipped out into the cold, silent world. A message in the stars.
Her horse, a tough, shaggy pony named Tallow for his dull white coat, was already waiting in the deep shadows of the forest just beyond the outer defenses. Sir Allard, her complex, demanding father, had made preparations. He would risk his life and his soul for her education and her skills because they were Viridian's only hope. Ilara mounted Tallow and rode into the black expanse of the forest. The journey to Lord Hrothgar's shattered manor would take 2 hours, and she had to be back before the first light when the gates were opened. As Tallow trotted steadily along the barely visible track, Ilara looked up at the night sky. The moon was a sliver, but the stars were spectacular, an overwhelming spray of white diamonds on black velvet. She didn't see the gods or the angels in the patterns as the local priest taught. She saw the clockwork. She saw the perfect mathematics of the Almagest. She knew the difference between a planet, the Greek word for wanderer, and a star. She knew how to use the Great Bear, Ursa Major, to locate the pole star, Polaris, the anchor of the northern sky. She even knew how to estimate the time using the star's rotation, a skill no woman and few men in the realm possessed. It was a profound, breathtaking moment of clarity. She was a simple, 15-year-old girl in a mud and stone world, yet she carried a piece of ancient and global knowledge, Arabic algebra, Greek astronomy, Roman medicine, that made her in some small, secret way more powerful than the feudal system that bound her. But the night was cold, and Lord Hrothgar's manor was an hour closer. The real world, the world of blood, agony, and iron necessity, was waiting.
Chapter 2. The Firewater and the Knife. The manor of Blackwood was a ruin. It wasn't the kind of clean, picturesque ruin that poets would sing about centuries later. It was a shattered, choked landscape of ash, blackened stone, and the sickly sweet smell of charred wood and decay. The fire had taken the main hall 2 weeks prior, and now only a single wing, the buttery and the oldest chapel, remained habitable. Ilara slipped Tallow's reins over a broken hitching post and entered the surviving wing. The air inside was freezing, but the small chamber where young Hugo lay was stifling hot, heated by a brazier burning expensive charcoal. Lord Hrothgar met her in the doorway. He was a thick, weary man, his face grimed with perpetual sorrow. The traditional stiff courtesies were gone, replaced by a desperate animal hope. "The leech is gone," he grunted, his eyes bloodshot. "Said the boy was beyond saving. Said it was the will of God and we should prepare the shroud." "God helps those who help themselves, my lord," Ilara replied, reciting a favorite, slightly irreverent phrase from her father's chaplain. She avoided looking directly into the room, already mentally steeling herself for what lay within. "I need space, hot water, and a strong man to hold him down." Hrothgar nodded curtly and led her into the chamber. The sight of Hugo was worse than the anatomical drawings had prepared her for. He lay on a mattress of straw, covered by a thin, damp blanket. He was scarcely older than Ilara, perhaps 16. But his face was drawn and white, slick with feverish sweat. The smell, the rank metallic odor of decay, clung to the air like mold. His arms and back, what she could see of them, were hideous. The skin was mostly black and leathery in large patches, where the fire had scorched him deeply, 3rd degree. Around these areas, the burns were red and weeping, covered in thick yellow pus that the local leech had mistaken for the body purging the bad humors. Ilara knew better.
That pus was the work of the animalcules, the tiny beasts of putrefaction. Historical fact for the U.S. audience. In the medieval period, pus, or laudable pus, was often considered a good sign, proof that the body was fighting the illness. Ilara's knowledge, which suggests pus is a sign of infection that must be removed, is a radical concept that anticipates modern germ theory by centuries. She turned to Lord Hrothgar, speaking in a firm, level voice that belied the terror coiling in her gut. "My lord, the boy is dying of the blackness within the wounds. We must clean them, deeply. It will be painful, and he may cry out, but he will live if we succeed." Hrothgar swallowed hard. "Do what you must. I will have the armorer, Ben, come in. He is strong. I cannot bear to watch my son suffer more." He retreated, leaving Ilara alone with the boy and the shadows. The cleansing fire. Ilara first focused on preparation. Her books stressed cleanliness. She ordered the servant girl, who was tending the brazier, to bring a large copper pot of water to a violent boil. The linen strips she had brought were placed into the boiling water to be sterilized, a practice the book described as burning the unseen contagion from the cloth. Next came the fire water. She uncorked the flask of distilled wine, its strong, pungent scent filling the small room, masking the stench of the wounds. It wasn't just for cleaning. The book suggested a double dose for the patient. "Hugo," she said softly, kneeling beside him, "you must drink this, all of it." He managed a dry cough. He looked at the flask with suspicion. "It burns." "It will burn away the sorrow and bring a dreamless sleep," Ilara promised, gently supporting his neck and holding the flask to his lips. The crude, high-proof alcohol, a rough antiseptic and anesthetic, worked quickly. Within minutes of downing the strong liquor, Hugo's eyes glazed over, his breathing became slow and heavy, and his limbs went slack. He wasn't unconscious, but deeply drunk and sedated, spared the full clarity of the agony to come. When the armorer, Ben, arrived, a mountainous man with hands like iron spades, Ilara explained her task. "You must hold his shoulders and hips. Do not let him move, no matter how loud he cries. It is for his life." Ben's face was a mask of fear and grim determination. He nodded, positioning himself. Ilara took up the small, sharp hunting knife. It wasn't a surgeon's scalpel, but it was the cleanest, sharpest steel she possessed. She held it over the charcoal fire for a moment to burn the tiny beasts, then plunged the tip into the boiling water to cool it slightly. Debridement. The unkindness of the knife. The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the rhythmic gasp of the charcoal fire and Hugo's heavy, drunken breaths. Ilara began on his shoulder. Her hands trembled, but her mind was cold and clear, focused entirely on the image of the skeleton and the muscle structure she had studied for hours. Cut only the dead black tissue. It must come off, or it will poison the living. She applied the knife. The dead flesh, necrotic tissue, was stiff and had no sensation, yielding to the blade with a soft, sickening give like cutting through cold leather. The first few cuts were easy. Hugo did not move. But as she moved closer to the edges of the living tissue, the deep, third-degree burns that abutted the second-degree weeping wounds, he began to stir. She paused, wiping her brow with her forearm. Her hands were already slick with blood and pus. "Hold him!" she hissed to Ben. When she resumed, cutting deeper, removing a particularly large, dead section from his back, Hugo erupted. A raw, guttural scream tore from his throat, muffled by the drink, but terrifying nonetheless. His body arched violently, but Ben held fast. The young noblewoman was now performing a gruesome, bloody debridement, the removal of the necrotic tissue. The book called for the wound to be made red again before healing could begin. It took her nearly an hour of agonizing, painstaking work. She cut away the black and white dead flesh, rinsing the knife repeatedly in the hot, steaming wine-water solution. She forced herself to breathe shallowly, ignoring the stench, ignoring Hugo's occasional tormented whimpers. Finally, she stepped back. The blackness was gone. The wounds were now open, raw, red, and bleeding, but they were clean of the obvious signs of putrefaction. "The washing!" she commanded Ben, her voice hoarse. The armorer, his face gray with shock, slowly brought a large basin. Ilara did not use the water. She poured the remaining distilled wine, the antiseptic, directly onto the raw, pulsing wounds. Hugo screamed again, a short, sharp cry of pure agony as the strong alcohol bit into the exposed flesh. Deuce's golden ointment. The final phase was the poultice. Ilara mixed the pulverized St. John's wort, known for its soothing anti-inflammatory properties, into the honey. The honey, thick and golden, was a miracle drug. It was naturally antibacterial and created an airtight protective seal against the surrounding filthy air. She coated the raw, bloody wounds thoroughly with the thick, sticky paste. It looked barbaric, like she was coating him in gold paint, but the book swore by it. The honey would draw out the fluids and starve the tiny beasts of air, while the St. John's wort soothed the heat. Finally, she took the sterilized linen, now cool and damp, and carefully wrapped the boy's back and arms, not too tightly, but firmly enough to keep the golden ointment in place. Ilara stepped back for the last time, dropping the bloodied knife and slumping against the stone wall. She was covered in sweat, blood, and the residue of the honey poultice. "He lives," she whispered, a fierce, exhausted relief flooding her. "The blackness is gone. The fever will break if God is willing." Ben, the strong armorer, crossed himself 3 times, his eyes wide. Lord Hrothgar, who had been waiting outside the door, rushed in, staring at his son's bandaged, silent form. "What is that smell?" he demanded, pointing to the thick golden syrup oozing from the bandages. "Honey, my lord," Ilara said, already retrieving her satchel. "The purest from our comb. I will be back at sunset tomorrow to change the dressing. He must be kept warm, dry, and given only clean water to drink." Hrothgar looked from the ghastly bandages to the small, exhausted girl who had just performed a surgery that no barber surgeon in the kingdom would dare to attempt. He saw not a child, but a force of strange, dangerous knowledge. "Ilara," he said, using her name for the first time with a respect he usually reserved for his knight commander. "You have bought my son life. If he lives, the pastures are yours, and my fealty will be sworn to your house forever." Ilara nodded, too weary to speak. She slipped out into the midnight cold, mounted Tallow, and rode back toward Viridian. Her hands were stinging, her muscles ached, but beneath the fear, a cold, hard ember of pride began to glow. She was not just a girl waiting for a marriage contract. She was a healer. She was a scholar, and she was dangerous.
Chapter 3. The King's Summons. The fever broke on the 3rd day. When Ilara arrived that morning, Lord Hrothgar was standing guard by his son's bedside, looking less like a weary man and more like a statue that had been chipped clean of all dust and worry. Young Hugo's skin was dry, his brow cool, and his eyes, though still hazy, were clear. Ilara carefully peeled back the honey-soaked bandages. The sight was a scholar's reward. Where the day before there had been angry red irritation, there was now a clean, pink ring of healing tissue, a granulated edge her book described as the body's perfect work. The great, sticky golden poultices of honey and St. John's wort had done their job. "The blackness will not return," Ilara announced, her voice trembling slightly. "He will live, but he must rest for a year, and the wounds must be kept clean with a clean poultice of bread and boiled milk for a fortnight more." Lord Hrothgar fell to his knees, not before God, but before Ilara. "House Viridian will have Blackwood's fealty," he swore, his voice thick with emotion. "And those 2,000 acres, the disputed pastures, they are yours. Cleared of all debt and levy, you have given me back my son." The political crisis for House Viridian was over. The land was secured not by shield and spear, but by the knife and the firewater. Ilara had done more for her family in 3 days than her father had managed in 3 years of negotiation. The whispering threat. Success, however, bred rumor. A few weeks after Hugo was out of danger, a visitor arrived at the manor. He was a man of the cloth, a scholarly monk named Brother Theophilus, who held a chair in chirurgy, surgery, at the new university in Salerno. He wore the robes of his order, but his hands were the hands of a man who worked with acids, not prayers. Ilara's father, Sir Allard, sat Brother Theophilus down in the meager library, but his gaze kept flicking to the hidden shelf where the forbidden books were masked by common hymnals. "My Lord Allard," the brother began, sipping the expensive wine with a critical eye, "I hear miraculous rumors from Blackwood. A wound that no physician could treat, one that turned black with the devil's influence, was cured by a simple poultice?" Sir Allard scoffed, trying to sound dismissive. "A country cure, brother, nothing more. My daughter, Ilara, merely applied a paste of honey and herbs. God favored the child, it seems." "Honey, yes, a fine emollient," Theophilus mused, his eyes sharp and unsettling. "But they say the wound was first cut clean, that the black meat was removed with a blade, and that the boy was so drunk he barely felt the pain." Allard paled. This was too specific. The brother leaned forward conspiratorially. "To remove dead flesh, to perform what we call debridement, is a subtle and dangerous act of judgment. One must know where the dead tissue ends and the living begins, or the patient dies of blood loss or shock. The only men in this kingdom with that knowledge are those of us who have studied the ancient texts of Galen and Ibn Sina, and we would never attempt such a thing outside of a teaching hospital."
He paused, letting the fear build. Yet someone at Blackwood had the confidence of a master. Someone had the texts, and I suspect, Sir Allard, that this is not a simple poultice, but a matter of heresy. Sir Allard's blood ran cold. The brother was not looking for a reward. He was looking for the books, for the knowledge, and to expose the unnatural practice of Ilara. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that this was only the first wolf to sniff at their door. The Royal Decree. That evening, as the sun bled fire across the stone fields, the matter of the brother Theophilus was brutally eclipsed. A royal messenger arrived, not the usual sweating footman, but a knight of the inner circle, Sir Callan, clad in the king's own livery. He did not ask to be fed or housed. He asked for Sir Allard and his daughter immediately. Sir Allard ushered Ilara and the knight into the private solar. Sir Callan unrolled a scroll sealed with the royal wax, his face grim. "A terrible misfortune has befallen the king, God save him. In a skirmish near the northern border, His Majesty King Edmund II was struck in the knee by a crossbow bolt." Ilara froze. A crossbow bolt was a blunt, powerful weapon designed to pierce plate. In the knee, it meant a shattered joint, bone fragments, and a mangled wound deep enough to be poisoning the king's blood. "The university physicians have been sent away," Sir Calin continued, his gaze falling directly at Ilara, who stood pale but rigid next to her father. They proposed amputation. His Majesty refused. He will not rule from a cart. They said they could not risk trying to remove the bolt, that the risk of bleeding or infection was too great. Sir Calin re-rolled the scroll with a snap. But the whispers of the scholar girl of Viridian have reached the capital, the one who cuts away the blackness and seals wounds with golden honey. The king needs a miracle, my lord. He is demanding the girl be brought to court immediately. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Her secret had moved from the realm of academic risk to high treason. If she failed, she was a charlatan who had killed the king. If she succeeded, she would be elevated beyond measure, but her secret library and its forbidden knowledge would be under the scrutiny of the entire kingdom. Sir Calin, Ilara asked, her voice steady, despite her pounding heart, what is the consequence of failure? The knight looked at her, his expression utterly devoid of warmth. If you fail, little healer, you will be executed for regicide before the sun sets the next day. The choice was no choice at all. Her life, her father's life, and the future of House Viridian now depended entirely on her ability to perform the most delicate, dangerous piece of surgery imaginable.
The royal operation. The journey to the royal palace in the capital felt less like a noble procession and more like a forced march toward the gallows. Sir Calin, the king's knight, ensured they rode hard. The danger was not just the king's wound, but the political turmoil that would erupt if his injury became public knowledge. Every league they traveled, the stakes and the risk of Ilara's exposure grew higher. Ilara carried her most critical tools in a small iron-bound chest. The firewater, a generous flask of distilled wine, Dawes's golden ointment, a heavy jar of her best honey, the knife, her carefully sharpened hunting blade, the probe, a new implement secretly forged by her father's smith, a long, thin iron rod with a small rounded loop at the end, designed to gently navigate a deep wound without cutting. She spent the entire ride rehearsing the procedure, not from her book, but from memory. The text was clear on deeply lodged projectiles. Do not draw out hastily, for the metal is fouled by the leather and the blood, and to bring it back through the wound brings the contagion deeper. The object must be drawn from the far side, or the wound must be widened. The chamber of dying light. The king's apartment was located in the oldest, most defensible tower of the palace, but it smelled like a sick room, heavy with the scent of unwashed bedding and stale air. The King Edmund II, a man famed for his battle-hardened physique, lay on a great bed. His face was gray, his lips cracked with fever, and his breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. His left leg, wrapped in linen rags, was swollen to twice its normal size. The flesh around the knee had taken on a mottled, dark purple hue, a stark and horrifying contrast to the pale whiteness of his skin. Ilara knelt by the bed. The royal physicians, old men in fur-trimmed robes, still clinging to their theories of Galenic humors, watched her with undisguised contempt. They had been dismissed, but their presence was a silent, judgmental threat. Sir Calin stood guard, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, a clear reminder of the king's decree. "Tell me, girl," the king rasped, his voice barely a sound. "The priests speak of God's will. The scholars speak of humors. What say you?" Ilara took a deep breath, fighting the urge to flee. "Your Majesty, the arrow is poisoned not by the devil, but by the dirt it carried into the wound. The flesh around the bolt is dying. If we do not remove the bolt and cleanse the flesh, the whole leg will die and poison your heart." "And your solution?" My solution, sire, is to make the wound bigger, to make the healing whole. I must find the bolt and draw it out cleanly, and then wash the wound with a fire that drives out the small demons of putrefaction." The king closed his eyes. "A madness, but the other path is the blade and the saw. Proceed." A needle in the bone. The king was given a full flagon of the distilled wine. It was a terrifying amount of alcohol, but the danger of pain-induced shock was greater than the risk of drunkenness. He slipped into a heavy, sweating slumber. Ilara placed her instruments on a clean wooden table. The royal physician scoffed. No silver, no gold, no vials of exotic powders, just a knife, a rod, honey, and wine. Her most immediate problem was the bolt. It was buried deep in the muscle tissue surrounding the knee joint, probably lodged against the femur or tibia. She used her finger to explore the wound entrance, an act that sent a wave of revulsion through the watching physicians. "Never touch the wound with a naked hand," their textbooks screamed. But Ilara knew she needed the sense of touch. She found the track of the bolt and began the gruesome task of widening the wound. She used her knife, cutting away the dead, darkened edges to create a wider, clean, open channel. She then plunged her copper probe into the wound.
This was the terrifying part. The bolt had likely shattered bone. A wrong move could sever a tendon, crush a nerve, or lead to uncontrollable bleeding. She worked by feel, gently pushing the probe deeper, the metal scraping against the hard shell of the bolt. The wound is deep, the arrow lies far from the entrance. She traced the length of the bolt, moving the probe in slow, gentle arcs, trying to measure the distance to the tip. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "It is too deep to pull back, sire," she muttered to the sleeping king. "I must go in from the other side." The second incision. With a shocking, audacious move, Ilara ignored the entrance wound entirely. She went to the other side of the king's knee, feeling for the faint, hard resistance of the bolt's tip beneath the surface of the swollen skin. The royal physicians gasped. An incision on the healthy side? Madness! Ilara made a deep, clean slice. Blood welled immediately, but she was prepared. She widened the hole until she could just glimpse the metal end of the bolt. The wood, linen, and leather of the bolt's fletching had torn off, leaving just the metal head and shaft deep within the tissue. Now came the innovation. She carefully inserted the iron probe into the original wound entrance and, using the rounded loop on the end, gently hooked it around the bolt's shaft. She did not use it to pull, but to guide the bolt head towards the second clean incision. Using a pair of small bone forceps, borrowed without permission from the palace cook's kitchen, she grasped the bolt head and with a smooth, decisive pull, drew the entire projectile clean out of the king's knee. It clattered onto the stone floor, silent but for the metallic ring. The physicians stared at the artifact, a brutal, iron-tipped projectile, foul with bone fragments and dark blood. Ilara did not celebrate. The king had lost blood, and the open wound was a gaping maw waiting for infection. She ordered the servant to pour the precious distilled wine, the firewater, into a clean, shallow basin. She poured a generous amount over the first jagged entrance wound, flushing out the debris and dark, stagnant blood. Then she poured the rest into the second, clean surgical wound. The king, in his deep, drunken sedation, let out a single strangled cry. The alcohol burned the exposed tissue, a fiery act of purification against the tiny beasts. She packed both wounds with sterile linen soaked in a solution of vinegar and boiled water, a final strong defense against the air. Finally, she sealed the area with the golden ointment, applying the sticky, protective honey paste deeply into the wounds, sealing them off from the contaminated air of the chamber. She wrapped the leg tightly in fresh, clean linen, making a firm, unyielding bandage. Ilara stood back, exhausted. Her arms were covered in blood. Her mind was reeling. She had done it. One of the royal physicians, a stout, pompous man named Master Gervais, approached her, his face a mixture of fury and stunned awe. "You have used the devil's brew to cut the king's own body," he hissed. "If he dies of fever in the morning, you will burn for witchcraft." Ilara looked him directly in the eye, her posture straight, and her voice resonating with a sudden, powerful authority that startled even Sir Calin. "If the king dies, Master Gervais, it will be because the king's physician failed to remove the poison in time. I have done the work your books forbade you to do. Now the king requires only two things: cleanliness and time. His bedding must be changed daily. He must drink only boiled water, and no other man is to touch this bandage until I return." She had not only saved the king, but she had directly challenged the established order of medicine in the royal court. Her secret was not safe. It was now a weapon.